Okay, let's dive into something that really caught my eye in the source material we have here. It's about the numbers on U.S. bachelor's degrees in science. We're talking the last 40 years or so, right?
That's right, roughly 1980 up to 2022, and the overall picture is, well, significant growth. Degrees more than doubled.
Yeah, 115% increase overall, which sounds huge,
Hmm.
but when you break it down by field,
That's where it gets interesting. Computer science, for example, just exploded, like over 600% growth.
wow. And biosciences too, right? They were up significantly.
Definitely. Biological and biomedical sciences surged, over 200% increase there. Big numbers.
But then you hit the physical sciences, physics, chemistry, that kind of thing.
And the story there is completely different. The growth was pretty flat, just 18% over 4 decades.
Just 18%, I mean, compared to that overall doubling.
Exactly. It means they're attracting a much, much smaller proportion of students than they used to.
The source actually puts a number on that, doesn't it? A relative decline.
Yeah, a 97% relative decline when you factor in the overall growth. It's pretty staggering.
97%. So you really have to ask why. Why aren't these foundational sciences keeping pace?
Why are they losing ground, relatively speaking? It's a major question.
And this is where, the source material introduces a pretty provocative claim.
Right, an allegation from Dr. Eric Weinstein.
He suggests something specific happened back in the mid-'80s involving U.S. science policy circles.
Yeah, he points fingers towards influential people, possibly at the National Science Foundation, maybe the National Academy of Sciences, too.
And the claim is that they deliberately engineered STEM immigration policies.
Well, that's the allegation. And the reason, according to Weinstein, wasn't just about competitiveness or filling gaps.
What was the alleged reason then?
He claims it was a deliberate attempt to basically suppress the wages of U.S. scientists.
Suppress wages? How?
By increasing the supply of talent from abroad. He uses some strong language, calling it lures for cheaper labor, even scientific backstabbing.
Okay, that's a very serious accusation. So for this deep dive, we need to unpack this.
Absolutely. We need to look at the data, this degree trend data.
And explore the policy context back then, mid-'80s, early '90s.
Examine the economics, too, the whole immigration piece for skilled workers.
And figure out what signals all this sends about, the value of a science career, especially in fields like physics or chemistry.
Right. We want to help you cut through the noise here, understand the complexities, and see why this stuff actually matters.
Okay, so back to the data. That 18% growth for physical sciences versus the boom elsewhere.
That 97% relative drop, it's more than just a number. It signals something about choices students have been making for a long time.
And that signal, that trend, is what sort of resonates with Weinstein's claim, right? Even if the claim itself is controversial.
His allegation is very specific. Around 1986, certain people, certain institutions.
With a specific intent keeping wages down by bringing in foreign scientists.
Right. That intent is key to his accusation.
So to evaluate that, we have to look at what was actually happening back then. The history, the policy environment.
And the source material digs into that. The mid-'80s policy scene was, well, it was complicated.
There was a lot of talk about national competitiveness, wasn't there? Like with Japan.
Oh, absolutely. Intense focus on it. Figures like Eric Bloch at NSF were pushing hard to link science and engineering much more closely to industry, to the workforce.
Weren't they setting up new research centers and things like that?
Yeah, engineering research centers, efforts to boost diversity in STEM domestically. That was all part of the mix.
And then there was this other thing the source mentions. Forecasts, predictions.
Yes, a really significant element. NSF's policy analysis group was putting out these projections.
What were they projecting?
Basically, big future shortages of scientists and engineers, a kind of looming crisis narrative.
Ah, the shortage argument. We still hear echoes of that today, don't we?
We do. But the source points out something crucial about those 80s forecasts.
Which was?
They were heavily based on demographic trends, population numbers, but they apparently didn't give much weight to how markets actually work. Things like wages adjusting, influencing supply and demand.
So they predicted shortages without really factoring in if, say, higher salaries might attract more people.
Exactly. Many economists and statisticians criticized the methodology at the time for ignoring those market signals. It painted a picture of just running out of people.
Leaving out the economics seems like a pretty big omission.
It is, but, and this is key, despite those acknowledged flaws, that shortage narrative turned out to be quite useful, politically useful.
Useful how? For getting more funding.
That was certainly part of it. It provided strong justification for boosting federal budgets for science and engineering.
Makes sense.
And it also supported arguments for policies to grow the STEM workforce overall.
Both getting more Americans into STEM and maybe looking elsewhere.
Potentially, yes. Encouraging domestic students, diverse backgrounds, and making the case for increasing the supply of talent from abroad.
Okay, so that's the mid-'80s climate. Competitiveness anxiety, this handy shortage story. But what about actual immigration laws changing?
Right, because the allegation centers on policy change. The source notes that the major shifts in law for high-skilled workers came a bit later than '86.
When they happen?
There was the Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA, in '86, but that was mostly focused on unauthorized immigration.
Not specifically high-skilled visas.
Not primarily. The really big expansion of visa categories specifically for high-skilled workers, the ones most relevant here, that came with the Immigration Act of 1990.
So a few years after the alleged conspiracy meeting.
Correct. The main legal pathways really opened up then.
And what about proof? Did the source find any evidence for that specific 1986 meeting, the wage suppression plan?
This is critical. The analysis reported in the source found no direct documentary evidence.
No smoking gun, no memo saying let's suppress wages.
Nothing like that was found, according to this material. No proof of a secret meeting with that explicit goal involving the named people.
So, Weinstein's claim, as presented here.
Seems to be an interpretation. An interpretation of known actions, like promoting those flawed forecasts, and perhaps allegations of internal studies about wage effects that weren't independently verified in this source's analysis.
So bottom line from this source, the specific 1986 conspiracy for wage suppression remains unproven by direct evidence.
That's what the source concludes on that specific point.
Okay, so no proof of the plot. But that doesn't quite close the book, does it? The source connects the broader history back to those degree trends we started with.
Exactly, and this is where it gets nuanced. Even without a proven conspiracy, that mid-'80s environment matters.
How so?
Well, you had that climate of competitiveness fears, you had the flawed but convenient shortage narrative.
Which specifically downplayed the role of wages.
Right, it minimized wages as a signal. The source argues that this whole atmosphere was conducive to policies that would end up favoring an increase in the supply of foreign STEM talent.
Even if the explicit goal wasn't wage suppression per se.
Potentially. The focus was supply, supply, supply based on shortage fears. And then the 1990 Act did come along and significantly expanded those high-skilled pathways.
Leading to more foreign-born scientists and engineers in the U.S. workforce.
Yes. Particularly noticeable among PhD researchers, the number did go up.
Okay, so let's loop back to the original problem. Physical science is growing just 18% over 40 years. That 97% relative drop.
Can we just blame that all on a potential unproven wage strategy from the '80s?
The source seems to say no, that's too simple.
Definitely too simple. There are obviously other factors at play, many other factors.
Right.
Oh, things like how clear the career paths look in different fields. Think about software versus, say, academic physics.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Shifts in funding priorities, maybe societal excitement around biotech or computing compared to older fields, even issues in K-12 education.
Yeah.
Teaching math and physics effectively.
So all that stuff influences student choices too.
Absolutely. It's a complex mix.
But that core idea in Weinstein's argument, the idea that policies affecting labor supply and pay can discourage domestic students, that still seems relevant, right?
It does. Even if the specific conspiracy isn't proven by this source, that mechanism is plausible.
Explain that a bit more.
Well, the source highlights this. If policies driven by competitiveness goals, or maybe by those flawed shortage forecasts, if they led to a perception or even a gradual reality.
The perception of what?
Of increased competition for jobs. Or maybe wages in physics not keeping pace with, say, computer science, or just generally less attractive career prospects compared to booming fields.
Then that perception or reality could steer students away.
It's entirely plausible that it would subtly influence choices over decades. It doesn't have to be a dramatic conspiracy.
Because students aren't dumb. They weigh their options right. They look at opportunity, competition, potential earnings.
As precisely, they compare paths. And if one path seems crowded or less rewarding relative to others,
they might choose differently.
That 97% relative decline is a powerful indicator that something made physical sciences less attractive compared to the alternatives over time.
And policies that flood the labor supply without a corresponding jump in demand or wages could contribute to that picture.
They could, even if unintentionally. It's about the signals the whole system sends, cumulatively over years.
The source also touches on the actual economics of high-skilled immigration. It's not straightforward, is it?
No, it's complex. It's not always just more workers equals lower pay for everyone.
What does the academic research tend to show?
The source mentions that many studies actually find more nuanced effects. Often foreign STEM workers are seen as complements to native workers.
Complements, meaning they help, not just compete.
Yeah, they might boost innovation, start companies, create new jobs. They can often have neutral or even positive effects on the wages of native-born STEM workers, especially highly educated ones.
And they tend to catch up in pay pretty quickly.
That's often observed, yes. Wage parity is usually reached relatively fast.
So maybe not the wage-crushing effect alleged across the board.
Not according to many broad studies. But there's a big however.
Okay, what's the caveat?
These average effects, these overall positives, can sometimes hide negative impacts in very specific areas.
Like certain subfields or types of jobs.
Exactly. Highly specialized niches, maybe certain postdoc positions, places where the competition might feel much more direct and intense for specific individuals.
And even if absolute wages don't fall, maybe they just don't rise as fast.
Right. Relative stagnation. Wages might not keep up with overall economic growth or productivity gains, or especially with the soaring salaries in fields like tech.
Which goes back to the signal students receive.
Exactly. That relative picture, or even just the perception of it, could definitely influence choices at the margin, pushing students towards fields that seem hotter, more rewarding. It's a long-term systemic thing.
Okay, let's try to pull the main threads together from this source. What are the key takeaways?
Okay. First, that's stark data. The 97% relative decline in physical science bachelor's degrees, undeniable. Second, the specific Weinstein allegation. Deliberate 1986 wage suppression plot via immigration, which this source says lacks direct proof of that intent or plan.
Third, the historical context. The mid-'80s did have that climate of competitiveness fears and the flawed shortage story that downplayed wages. That set a certain stage.
Fourth, the major laws expanding high-skilled immigration came later, mainly 1990.
And fifth, the economics are complex. High-skilled immigration often complements, but negative impacts aren't impossible in specific niches, and relative wages matter.
So the core message here isn't necessarily about proving a conspiracy.
No, it's more that the policy environment, shaped by those past anxieties and narratives, especially narratives that stress supply over wage signals, likely contributed to the long-term trends in student choices.
Policies send signals.
Yeah.
About opportunity, competition, value, whether intended or not.
Precisely.
And understanding this history, it matters for today, right? For thinking about the U.S. STEM pipeline now. Absolutely. Especially for those foundational sciences, physics, chemistry. It tells us that attracting global talent is important, yes. But policy also needs to signal strongly that careers in all science areas are valued and rewarding for domestic students, too.
It shows how broad policies, even ones based on maybe incomplete data back then, can ripple out over decades, shaping individual choices in ways perhaps nobody fully intended.
Yeah, that relative decline didn't happen overnight. It's about the whole system, the incentives, the signals over the long haul.
Which kind of leaves us with a final thought, something for you to consider.
If policies from the 80s and 90s, maybe driven by things like competitiveness or those shortage narratives, could subtly reshape the landscape of science over 40 years just by changing the signals about opportunity.
Then what signals are today's policies sending? Policies around funding, immigration, education. What signals are they sending right now about the science careers of the future?
And how might those signals be shaping the choices the next generation of students are making today? It makes you think about those hidden currents, the systemic factors guiding talent towards some fields and maybe away from others.